Okay, hi there. Welcome to a macro video focusing on growth and development, and in particular covering some of the key issues to do with the extent to which tourism as an industry, as a sector, can be a catalyst for growth and development, particularly in lower and middle income countries. The global travel and tourism sector is absolutely vast. Its contribution to GDP globally was nearly $3 trillion in 2019, and clearly hundreds of millions of jobs depend directly and indirectly on the tourism sector. But of course, the pandemic, which has pushed governments to close borders and halting essentially all but essential travel for many months, that pandemic has dealt a severe hit to the world tourism industry, and in particular the tourist sector of many emerging developing countries. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, tourism's contribution to global GDP, the value added from tourism, fell nearly 50% in 2020, compared with a contraction of world output of just under 4%. Crucially, the industry as a whole is a major generator of GDP and jobs and investment for a number of countries. These are the nations with the biggest percentage share of GDP in 2019 that comes directly from travel and tourism. And obviously Macau, a gambling hub in Southeast Asia, but countries like Maldives, nearly 1/3 of GDP directly related to travel and tourism. The Seychelles, 26%, and the Bahamas, nearly 20%. So most of these countries here have a significant tourism sector. The industry as a whole is estimated to generate well over 300 million jobs worldwide. And these are the countries with the highest employment, people in work, in travel and tourism in 2019. So this was the year before the pandemic, and obviously India and China have absolutely vast levels of employment. But in countries like, for example, Mexico, 4.5 million people, Vietnam, 2.5 million people, and Thailand likewise. Far more people employed in tourism than, for example, in the United Kingdom economy. So it's a major source of employment, and crucially, it's also a significant source of revenues for many countries. I've highlighted here Thailand. Quite a few of my students have been thinking about countries like Thailand and Indonesia and Bangladesh and Vietnam in their growth and development studies. And in 2019, again, $60 billion worth of revenue from tourism, exceeding the UK by about 20% there. France and Spain, of course, big tourism economies in the European Union. And the risk, of course, at the moment is that COVID-19 has caused essentially an unprecedented crisis for the tourism industry, the collapse of tourist arrivals from ships and from planes and things. And who knows, tourism is not likely to recover until the world is vaccinated, until we have a global grip on the pandemic. And something like 100 million plus jobs are at risk, according to this survey from the World Bank. The majority of the jobs lost in 2020 are in Asia Pacific, but also note Africa there, 7.6 million jobs potentially lost. The World Bank thinks that something like 1 in 20 jobs in sub-Saharan Africa is in the travel and tourism sector, and that generates nearly $40 billion for the continent. So the African economy has also taken a big hit. So that's a bit of context for you. Here's a couple of slides just looking at the classic exam question: assess the impact that tourism can have on growth and development in, for example, low and middle income countries. Well, in the exam or in the assessment you'd choose a couple of key issues to assess. Well, the first one is to think about some of the advantages, some of the positives for developing countries investing in their tourism sector. Let me pick out 6 points for you, and of course obviously in an assessment you would choose which ones you wanted to focus on and support them with some diagrams, presumably some ADAS diagrams. First point is that tourism is a major source of jobs. It creates employment, and often tourism tends to be quite labour intensive. You think about people working in hotels and restaurants. It's pretty labour intensive, so it helps to create increased formal employment, which of course if people are in work earning a decent wage can lead to an increase in the tax revenues of governments. Linked to that is point 2, that tourism typically employs a higher percentage of women. So it's quite important from a gender perspective. And also often, and I think you may well know this as young people often start out in industries such as travel and tourism and hospitality. So it's a key source of employment for young people. And we know in many developing nations, emerging countries, that youth unemployment is a particular problem. The third advantage is it generates export earnings. Dollars and yuans and yen and pounds and euros. It's a key source of export earnings, generating foreign exchange for countries. Tourism is a service, so it helps to improve, if you can run a surplus on your tourism, it helps to improve the current account of your balance of payments. And oftentimes the investment that comes into tourism from overseas is an important plus on the financial side of a country's balance of payments accounts. But crucially, it generates foreign exchange earnings for countries, and those dollars can be used to import key pharmaceutical products or key bits of machinery, etc. A lot of students make the fourth point, and I think it's a great point to make, that tourism is an important potential source of diversification away from primary product dependency. So whatever it is, medical tourism, for example, in countries such as Tunisia, or whatever nature-based tourism in countries like Rwanda, represents an alternative to just extracting raw materials and a very heavy focus on the primary sector. Tourism can provide an important boost, a lift to aggregate demand. Of course, obviously tourism is an export, but it generates local and regional incomes, and also crucially it can generate multiplier effects. So people employed in tourism spend their money, and there could be a tourism multiplier from money coming in from overseas tourism. And not only does it affect aggregate demand, you can also make quite a convincing case for saying that tourism can increase long run aggregate supply, particularly if you get tourism related investment in better airports, in telecom systems, in ports, in new roads, in new hotels and related infrastructure. So long and aggregate supply can also increase. Don't be afraid. Strongly encourage you to use aggregate demand and supply analysis to support your points. However, if you're asked to assess, examine, discuss, there are of course significant risks and potential downsides, disadvantages, when emerging countries particularly shift their resources into tourism. Let's pick out 6 of them for you, and you would choose the points you want to make in an exam based on what your exam board requires. The first is that often the idea that this provides well-paid formal employment can be challenged and questioned. The exploitation of local labour by overseas transnational tourist businesses. You see, big hotel companies, for example, Hilton Hotels, they may well have quite significant monopoly power in the local labour market. They're employing lots of people, and that in theory could drive wages lower than they would otherwise be. A second related point is that many workers in tourism are actually migrants, and they may well suffer from poor employment conditions. If you think about tourism hubs such as the United Arab Emirates, in a place like Dubai and things, where a significant percentage of people working in those industries are not local people, but people who've come in, migrant workers. And there are often quite big concerns, legitimate worries about the conditions under which they're employed. Inward investment into tourism is an important positive, but the profits from those investments often flow out, particularly from foreign-owned resorts. And if you think about all-inclusive deals, where people essentially just arrive at the airport, get driven to a hotel, an all-inclusive resort, lie on the beach for a week and then head home, all-inclusive deals often ignore much of the local economy, and that can reduce the size of the tourism multiplier. And then there's market failures issues. So, for example, big growth of tourism can create negative externalities from both consumption and production. The construction industry generates externalities, increased congestion, and of course increased waste and pressure on natural resources, including water scarcity. Another potential downside is that tourism, particularly people, for example, buying second homes as tourist homes, that can lift property prices and make housing less affordable for local people. And if tourism causes a domestic economic boom, great for GDP and jobs in the short term, but also potentially a risk of a rise in inflation, which increases the cost of living for local people. And I suppose there are wider, deeper pressures on local cultures, the risk of homogenization from ubiquitous foreign multinationals such as Starbucks and McDonald's. And we've seen in the last year or so significant concerns over security, global security, and public health, the extent to which, for example, the pandemic was accelerated by millions of international tourist movements in and out of countries. So some potential downsides here, potential drawbacks, which would all be really good to talk about as part of your evaluation. Can tourism be a catalyst for growth and development? The answer is yes. Many countries successfully doing that. We'll think of countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and many others. But you have to be aware of the potential downsides as well. Okay, well, I hope you found this video useful for your revision and your assessments and your exams. Stay safe, take care, everybody, and hope to see you again sometime soon.